here, and the next presentation will be, or should be, a little bit more fun, not heavy stuff. So we're going to talk about practical aspect of catechizing, and this is something that was brought up to me by a few people last time when we had conference here, is to basically how to keep our children, young adults, kind of paying attention to whatever we are trying to say in class here. Is that the problem? Yes, no, Roshkin? So we try to address that topic today. And to talk about it, I thought of Dr. Christina Dolyniuk here. She is a psychology professor at Rider University here, not too far away in New Jersey. And she's been doing that for a while, too. And to introduce her, she's an associate professor at Rider University here, and her basically or she's a specialist in learning disorders and developmental disabilities. She also does research, applied community-based research that examines inclusion, perceptions, and attitudes towards people with disabilities, social skills, development, and intervention in cultural factors as well. She received her BA, a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of California in Los Angeles. Also, she received her master's degree in special education and educational therapy, also from California State University there, and also a PhD degree she received in Canada, right there in the middle of Canada. It is University of Calgary. It's in Alberta province there, and right now she's teaching here once again at Rider University. Without any further ado, прошу пані Христину.
Дякую, дуже дякую, Владико. Thank you all very much for attending this presentation, and I'm very honored and thrilled that I've been asked to take part in this conference. Certainly I never foresaw at any point in my life that I might be presenting at this type of conference. I presented at many other conferences, obviously professionally. But this is a topic that is obviously very near and dear to all of our hearts. And I think that it's a very important topic. How do we capture children's attention? How do we motivate young people to be interested in studying the catechism throughout their life? And so I hope to offer you some good suggestions as you go out into the world and practice our catechism and share it with young people. So the topic, is the volume okay? Because it sounds very loud to me. It's okay? Okay, good, thank you. The topic is, of course, teaching catechism. And I'm coming to you from a developmental perspective. I was trained as a developmentalist, as Vladika Andrei said. I have a PhD in educational and developmental psychology, and I am a specialist who works with children of all ability levels. So my perspective is, how do we motivate them at the appropriate developmental level? And I'm going to talk about attention, cognition, and learning, but I'm going to talk to you also about a few other things. So, you already know my background professionally, but I also wanted to add that I am a practicing Ukrainian Catholic. I'm a member of the church, an active member of the church. I can't tell you that I am in church every single Sunday, but we try to be there absolutely as much as we possibly can. And part of the reason why is because I'm a very busy working mother. And we have two very active children, and I will explain some of those challenges to you as well, because I think it's important that you hear them. And I speak on behalf of all parents and not just my family. I also wanted to add that I am an active member of the broader Ukrainian community. Some of you, I do know, some of you, unfortunately, a few people left that I know. I'm sorry that everybody couldn't stay to the end. But I also happen to be a Dolyniuk, or a counselor, in the Ukrainian American Youth Association, SUM. And I also serve on the board of directors at the Ukrainian Heritage School here in Jenkintown. So I think I offer you a diverse perspective on our young community in the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and certainly probably in some other churches as well. I also wanted to add that I have taught catechism, very briefly, when I was a graduate student, a young person, not so young anymore, but when I was in graduate school, I was asked to teach catechism in my home parish where I grew up in Los Angeles, California, and I taught it to a small group of bilingual children, some of whom had just come from Ukraine, others who were born and raised in the United States. So I've kind of had that experience as well, and I wanted to share some of that with you. But I want to emphasize something very much. As you can see, I come from a different perspective. I am not an expert in the catechism, and I don't think that I was asked here for that reason. So please bear with me. So the practical issue at hand. How do we capture and keep children's attention during catechism lessons? My first point is very important, and one that you probably already are aware of. This is not an easy or straightforward answer. It's not. No one, regardless of age, ever attends to everything they hear, see, or experience at any one moment in time. It's simply impossible. Our neurological systems are tapped to the max at all times because our senses are bombarded with information constantly. And there are also some very real limitations for children because their minds are still growing. And so the very first thing that I want to tell you and remind you of is that it's never going to be possible for them to attend to everything you tell them. And I think that we need to know that, realize that, and accept that, because just because they didn't hear every single word didn't mean that they didn't get the big message. I think that's very important. I also want to talk to you about the fact that there are similarities and differences in children's development. And obviously, we have to consider the context in which they are learning and the information that you are providing. Because I think that context plays a very significant role in what they're going to retain. So, the purpose of my talk, obviously to share my professional knowledge with you in psychology and in education, and I hope that we'll have time for questions at the end. And with regard to that professional knowledge, obviously, the general similarities among children of various ages, and also to think about individual differences within every particular age group, because they always exist, and I don't think that we should generalize anything. Okay? I also want to offer some of my personal experiences, and as I said already, some suggestions. Hope to help the community at large. So let's start here with part one. This is the more technical part, if I can call it that. As I've already pointed out, there are some very general similarities among all children of various age groups. And I think that all of us sort of intuitively know that, but maybe we don't know the specifics of what they are. I'd like to talk a little bit about attention and how it changes over time. I'm going to talk to you about what we refer to as an information processing loop, and that there are different types of attention. So when you ask me the question of how do we get children to attend to what we're saying, or to listen to us, because that's really what we mean, right? Keep in mind that there are different types of attention. There really are, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm also going to talk about different stages of cognitive development. And I'm just going to briefly pause here for a minute. I see that some of you have already found my slides in the packets. Feel free to use those. they should have all been copied. Okay, and then finally, like I said, these individual differences that pertain to learning and impact on children's development. There's a lot of diversity within the groups of children that you teach, even though they're the same age. And I'm sure you're probably aware of it, and you see this from the first day. So you'll have those kids that sit there really quietly, nicely, listen, and attend, right? And those are the kids that you love to have in class, right? And then you have children in that same class that can't sit still. They fidget all the time. Keep in mind, they may be listening. They're just moving. It's true. It really is true. And I don't know why you're chuckling, whether you agree with me or why, if you don't, but there are a variety of reasons for why children might fidget. They might fidget and move around because they're uncomfortable. Maybe, they can't sit still for a long period of time for some sensory reason. Could be that they're totally bored, right? There are so many different reasons. And children vary in their levels of activity, and their need for activity differs depending on a couple of different things. Some children mature more quickly than others. The ones that are less mature neurologically probably will need to move around more. Okay? So these are things to keep in mind. So I will talk about diversity a little bit. I also want to spend some time talking to you about different types of learners. There is some really interesting research out there, some of which you may know about. If you have studied any sort of educational philosophies, or if you studied psychology at any point in your careers, you may have heard about Dr. Howard Gardner, and he talks about multiple intelligences. I'm going to talk a little bit about that theory because I think it's very useful in teaching children. And I think you can use it very effectively in teaching catechism. So I want to share that with you.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. All right, so let's start off with the sort of nitty-gritty stuff. Information processing or learning. This model, this idea of information processing, equates the human mind with a computer. And it attempts to explain how the human mind might take in information, process that information, and how individuals will then respond in response to stimuli. Now, I could teach an entire semester course on information processing. That's not our purpose here today. So I've really streamlined this. If anybody wants further details, you can come and talk to me individually or reach out to me personally. That's fine. Well, what do I want you to take away from this today? And how does it relate to catechism? Well, you'll notice the bolded terms here: attention, sensation and perception, encoding, working memory, short-term memory, long-term memory. These are the elements of the information processing loop. These are the parts. And what theorists say is that our senses are continually active. They're continually bombarded with information. Stop and think for a moment just now. You are sitting here. You may be sitting very quietly, and you may think that you're not being bombarded. But you really are. You are currently being bombarded with lots of sensory input. You're hearing my voice, which is auditory. You're sitting in a chair which may or may not be comfortable, which is a tactile stimulation. And now that I've directed your attention to that, you're thinking about that, right? Right? You're also seeing things. You see me moving around. You might find my arms very distracting, and I use them a lot. But I'm not going to apologize for that because that's just who I am. That being said, think about that child that's fidgeting, right? And similarly, there are many other visual, auditory, and tactile stimuli in the room that you haven't paid attention to. Like there's some lights here that you might find distracting when I direct your attention to them. Maybe you noticed them before. I must tell you, when I first walked into the room, the first thing that I noticed was this beautiful icon. And that's where I was looking for a good part of the first talk. Part of the reason for that is a couple of things. I may be limited in the knowledge and experience of studying scripture, and I may not be able to relate to everything that the person is saying. That's also true for our children, right? And similarly, something that you don't know about me, and I'm going to tell you now, something very deeply personal, is that I absolutely love icons. And I absolutely love icons, not only because they're beautiful, because they represent my tradition, but my mother, who I was extremely close to, and unfortunately died at a very young age, was an artist and an iconographer. And that is a very personal and meaningful thing that actually draws me regularly to the church. That is something that you can't teach, right? But I tell you all these things because obviously, my attention when I walked in was not on the speaker. My attention was directed here. And I will also tell you that the first thing I thought of when I saw the Blessed Mother with this beautiful cloth, right? We call her the pokrova in Ukrainian. I know that we prayed to her to help us. And guess what I did? Because I was a little nervous walking in here. Perhaps a little intimidated because you are all knowledgeable in catechism. So, again, our senses are continually active, but as I talk about sensation, notice I mentioned a couple of other things here too in this information processing loop. Didn't I? I talked about focusing, filtering, and controlling the sensory input so that I could select what was important to attend to, right? I talked about encoding information or making it meaningful. And I mentioned some deeply personal, emotional stuff. I'm willing to bet that all of you are going to remember my story about this icon, and you probably will remember what I said about my mom. Right? Because I called your attention to it, I made it really personal, meaningful, and I encoded it for you. Does that make sense? Questions about that? Okay. Now, in this information processing loop as well, we have memories. And unfortunately, our memory tricks us sometimes. It's not really truthful all the time. And that's because emotions affect how we think about things. Okay? But memory has several processes. There's the working memory, the short-term memory, the long-term memory. Again, you've probably heard some of these terms before, right? Am I correct? Yes? They're all related though. So working memory is the type of memory we use when we're remembering something new, okay? And we're working on it, and we're making meaning of it. Short-term memory is what we store for the short term, and theorists say that we can only remember about 7 items. I'm sure you've heard that number 7 before, for about a duration of 30 seconds. So we have to work on it if we want it to go into long-term memory. And this is the reason why half the time when we hear something, we forget it. Because we didn't do anything with it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm telling you all this, why? Because our children are limited at every age in all of these sensory systems because their neurons, their nerve cells, their brains are still growing. They're not fully developed yet. Okay? It might be hard for you to sit here and listen to me talk at the end of the day after hearing so many other presentations. Imagine how hard it is for them. Okay? Additionally, as I said before, there are multiple different types of attention. Okay? Sustained attention is how long we can focus on something. Selective attention is what we choose to pay attention to. There's divided attention or multitasking, which our young people are more and more engaged in, and it's not always a good thing. And I know you know what I mean. It's this, right? But the phones need to be connected downstairs in a centralized place when they come home, so that they're not looking at them during homework, okay? Now, I know many schools have rules like this, and hopefully you have rules about it as well. But these rules are not consistent in every context. And so many young people, including 7- and 8-year-olds, are doing this. They're not listening to you. They're not. Despite what they say, despite my college students telling me, well, I can multitask, I say, no, the research shows that you can't. Sorry. Okay? There are other forms of attention. Joint attention refers to paying attention to the same thing at the same time. When I gave you the example earlier of how I walked in here and I was supposed to be listening to the speaker, but I was paying attention to the icon, we were not engaged in joint attention. Because that person and I, although we should have been focused on the same thing, were attending to two different things. And the reason why I point this out is, yet again, this is another thing, another aspect of the information processing loop that becomes increasingly easier for children as they get older. It's not something that they are proficient at from a very young age. In fact, some children with some types of disabilities never learn how to do this. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about how, there are large numbers of children in our classrooms, or perhaps even in your catechism classes, who might have varying types of learning disabilities or disorders. Okay? And then the final one is the most complex form of attention, and it's really about how we keep a goal in mind and we problem solve to meet that goal. It's when we have a long-term plan in mind. So when we say we want to teach the catechism, what is our overall goal? What do you want them to take away? Okay? You want them to pay attention. I think it's important for you to identify what is it that you want them to take away from every lesson. That's a good rule of thumb, to have one thing in mind. What do you really want them to take away? Okay? So, I've talked about the information processing loop, but there are also different stages of development at different ages. Our ability to attend and understand information changes as we age and as we mature. I've already told you that. Very young children primarily use their senses and their motor skills to problem solve and to think. They use their senses and their motor skills. That means that they reach out for objects. They're very attracted to things that move. They attend to your voice. They turn their head when they see music, or hear music rather. And you see those big icons in church. Those are really cool. They're visually stimulating. Okay? That continues for a long time. Now, there will be theorists that will tell you that they immediately jump to another stage of thinking by the age of 2, but keep in mind that it's not that they jump to a different stage of thinking. Their senses and their motor skills are still very, very active and very, very important and very useful to them when they are sitting in your catechism classes as school-age children. It's just that they're also capable of different types of thinking as well. Okay? So those sensations, those motor skills are still very active by the time they're sitting in catechism. When we talk about teens and adults, they can think abstractly and hypothetically. Okay, so that third point on my slide here, they think hypothetically and abstractly, and that's because their neurological system has matured yet again. In fact, research tells us, shows us, and could even, and I'm not going to, but I could even show you actual neurological scans of brains of kids who are exiting adolescence and going on into adulthood, and you'll see that there are these huge bundles of neurons that emerge in late adolescence. Okay, neurons are the basic nerve cell of the brain. Now, those additional neurons help them in thinking at an entirely different abstract cognitive level. Levels that children going through catechism can't think about that yet. And so when we talk about scriptures or we talk about God, these are all really abstract concepts for them. They will not understand them at the level that you and I understand them, nor will they understand them even at the level that their teenage brothers and sisters do. So, to summarize what I wanted to say about children going to First Confession First Confession and Solemn Communion, is that they might be thinking very concretely and using very structured thinking. And they do engage their senses and their motor skills, and we want to capitalize on that. We really do. We should capitalize on that. Okay? Some of you may have heard about the theory of Piaget. How many of you are familiar with this particular theory? Not everyone in the room. Okay? So this is the reason why I'm going to talk about Piaget briefly. I hope not to bore you. But Jean Piaget was a Swiss, and he called himself a genetic epistemologist, referring to the origin of knowledge. And he actually had a PhD in biology, which most people don't know. But he wrote one of the most prominent and highly regarded theories of cognitive development, and it's widely used in both education and in psychology. Some people mistakenly think that he was a psychologist. I'll just point out that he wasn't. And if you do take a look at his readings, one of the things that you'll see is that he uses a lot of biological terms because he was trained in biology. So he talks about things like adaptation and assimilation, which organisms do. Okay? But he identified 4 stages of cognitive development. And I've put a graphic in here to kind of help you if you are not familiar with the theory. And even for those of us that this might be a helpful thumbnail sketch of what it is that children of different ages do when they're thinking. So, as I noted already, between birth and 2 years of age, children engage in sensory motor thinking, which means that they use their senses and their motor skills quite a bit, right? They put everything in their mouth, right? That's a sense. Taste is a sense, right? They reach for things, right? They orient to sounds. And what propels them into the next developmental phase is the attainment of object permanence. And what Piaget referred to as object permanence was the ability to hold a mental representation in their mind and understand that objects exist. They exist even though they're out of sight. Because if a child has not yet attained object permanence, they will only respond to objects that they can touch, taste, hear, feel, right? And objects that their motor skills can reach. But if they can reach for that toy behind the pillow that I hid back there, they've attained object permanence, which means that they understand, they hold it in their mind. They have a cognitive representation that even though I can't see the toy anymore, it's there. And we do see this sometimes. There's lots of research, tons to document, that babies, young babies who have not yet attained object permanence will not look for a toy that somebody hides from them, out of sight, out of mind. That saying, out of sight, out of mind. But slightly older babies, and certainly those that are typically developing by the age of 2, will look for the object. Okay? So, when they move on to this phase, the next phase, the pre-operational phase, they have that capacity to mentally represent objects. They can now do what Piaget referred to as operate on them. Okay? Operating on them means that they can think logically and start putting things together. They're not ready for algebra yet, right? This is why we don't teach algebra to 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, although we teach them the basics, right? We teach them the precursors to operational thinking. That means that we teach them what the numbers represent, right? That symbol and what it represents. Similarly, if you have a child that's growing up in a home where there are icons all over the place, and parents wear their crosses and their medallions daily, okay? Or they pray before a meal, right? During this phase, they're going to understand that the cross means something spiritual. It means God. And if you ask the child, I remember vividly asking my children, you know, after I told them what it was and after they saw it 100 times, you know, well, what's that? They would consistently say, regardless of what the icon was of, when they were little kids, Pobozia. Right? Those of you that understand Ukrainian know what I mean, Pobozia. Right? That's God. Now, really, this is not God. Right? We all know that. But that's their mental representation, their understanding that this is a symbol and it represents something. Is that making sense? Okay. All right, so during this phase, they learn symbolic thinking. Language is used and develops, right? Most children develop their language system quite vividly. They can speak in full sentences by the time they're 6, right? Most children these days speak in full sentences long before that. My daughter was very verbal from a very young age. And their imagination grows. That also means that when they imagine things, they can easily get frightened. And I remember my children asking me at a very young age, Mama, чому той Бог такий злий? If they saw an icon that suggested that there was some emotion or anger there. Now, I could explain to them, and for those of you that didn't understand that, I apologize. I'll paraphrase or translate it into English. You know, sometimes they might see an image and they might be fearful because it looks angry to them, or they interpret the emotion, and they'll ask the question. Okay? Their imagination then goes wild, right? And we do see this. By 7 to 11 years, most children, the ones that you're going to be teaching in catechism, perhaps, are just entering a concrete operational phase. Which means that when you have children sitting around the catechism classroom table, and I don't know what the size of your classes are, I'm sure they vary. I know when my son went through his catechism before his first communion, there were only 2 boys. When my daughter went through her catechism, there were 20 girls and boys. Okay? So they vary, right? It depends. But sitting around that table, you could have some children that are here, just finishing off and starting to understand these symbolic representations, whereas you could have others that are thinking very logically already. Do you see that? Does that make sense? And that, of course, causes some dilemma because they're not all ready to hear the same thing at the same time. They're not. Obviously, that means we would need to individualize instruction for every single child. That's practically not possible, right? I would hope, and I know this is a real problem, I would hope that parents would be that scaffold for them, right? Some parents will engage and will reinforce and will discuss with them at home, and they will practice at home. Others will not. And obviously that's not your fault. So, although Piaget said a lot of really good things, obviously, okay, from my perspective and probably from yours, there are other phases of development that happen after 12 years of age, okay? But the data that he collected focused primarily on how the mind matures after puberty. That's what he was really talking about, okay? And at that phase, individuals are thinking abstractly, they can think about hypothetical ideas, they can understand that issues have multiple solutions sometimes. Problems have more than one answer sometimes, right? But if you ask the school-age child what the answer is, there's always one right or wrong. And we do tend to teach catechism that way, and forgive me if I'm misspeaking, but I do think we tend to teach children about the church sort of in good and bad. This is what you should do, these are the rules, these are the guidelines, this is the good stuff, and this is the bad stuff. And my daughter's reached that point where she's like, I don't think that's always right. I don't think that's always true. Or she'll ask me a question like, how come the church constantly talks about males, or I only see male role models serving in the church, and forgive me, sisters, I know that you're in the church and involved, but in those roles up front at the altar, she asks me, why is it all men? Okay, so she's asking these hypothetical questions, and questions that I don't always have answers to. And I say, well, it's tradition and this sort of thing. But I want you to, and I'm not, please don't misunderstand, I'm not criticizing anything. I wanted to share with you my personal experiences, and I want you to understand where they're coming from. And this might help understand why some young people, unfortunately, move away from the church. Okay? All right, so I've given you some understanding, hopefully, of how children's minds might be generally similar at different phases of development. And of course, this describes typical development. We all know that not everybody develops typically, right? Some kids fall away from the norm for a variety of reasons. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that diversity. Okay? Yes, boys and girls are different, but I will tell you that I don't think boys and girls are as different as we have a tendency to think. Yes, but again, I think that comes down to the neurological timetable. There is research that shows that most girls mature faster physically and neurologically than boys do. Okay? But not by a tremendous amount. By a couple years, okay? And that evens out by the time they become late adolescents. But at the point where they're sitting in your class, you said second grade, is that what I heard? Third grade? Yeah, by the time they're sitting in your class, they still could be 2 developmental years behind the girls. And there are multiple reasons for that, I think. But I think it boils down to this, that we also socialize boys and girls differently. We do encourage boys from a very young age to be far more active. And again, there is psychological research that shows that. And so girls' acceptable social role is to sit quietly, whereas for boys, we encourage them from a very young age to engage in more rough and tumble kinds of play, more activity. So by the time they get to 3rd grade and they're 8 years old, right, they've been reinforced for this for a long time. Not just in your class, I'm not saying this specifically in your classroom, but in a whole bunch of other contexts. And that's why I want to talk about context as well, okay? All right, so we've already touched then a little bit about sensory and learning differences, but I want to talk about this. What are the ways in which children might differ from each other within each of those age groups, regardless of which stage of Piaget's development we're talking about? And specifically, my emphasis, my focus is going to be those children that have just exited pre-operational thinking around the age of 7, possibly even 6, because some are more advanced than others, and others who are already in that concrete operational stage where they're thinking more logically. Okay? That's the group of kids that you're targeting, right? 7 to 9-year-olds, that's the group of kids you're targeting when you're teaching catechism. For first confession. Later on I'm going to talk about it. I already talked about this with you, that, obviously catechism is a lifelong process, but that's not what the mainstream public thinks, right? Anyways, neurologists currently identify 9, not 5, 9 senses. So we have a tendency to think about sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, right? We think about those. But neurologists say that there may be many more than that. In fact, in preparing for this talk, I actually read up a little bit about this because, neurological development is not specifically my particular area of expertise. So I read up a little bit on this. And I read a paper that suggested that there could be as many as 15 different senses. Okay? So what are the other ones that we may not be familiar with? The ones that we may not be familiar with are the sensory differences in how we process pain. Okay? Some people experience pain unusual ways. They do. And by unusual, I mean that they might be hypersensitive to pain or hyposensitive to pain. They might experience a whole heck of a lot more of it or a lot less of it. I see this quite a bit with the children that I work with who have autism, because I happen to be an autism specialist. Children with autism experience hyper and hyposensitivities a lot. Pain is one of them. So I will see a kid playing outside on a playground, coming down a slide, and a child with autism might have fallen down and is bleeding. And, I want to run and attend and help them, and they just keep going. The bleeding, the pain doesn't seem to bother them. They just keep going. Now, obviously, there's a real danger in that. But they do seem to process information differently. So sensory stimulation, including pain, might be different. They may be hyposensitive to it, which means they need a lot more to feel what you and I feel, or just a tiny little touch, and it's painful to them. And kids with autism do that too. That's why some kids with autism don't want to be hugged. But it's only some of them, not all of them. Okay? Making sense? Another one might be balance and equilibrium. That's another sense. Some children need that movement. So getting back to your question, there are some children that crave this constant movement, right? And those children might be the ones that like to play on the swing for long periods of time. They like to rock. Okay? So if they're in a situation perhaps where they're not really interested, or maybe it's novel information or something that they're bored with, they might do something that they find more pleasurable. Which means they might start rocking, or they might start moving, or they might start fidgeting. Okay? So neurologists currently say that there are 9, okay, plus, like I said, 12 I read about today. The point is that our sensory systems are not as simple as we used to think. Okay, I know when I was in kindergarten, and certainly when my children were in kindergarten, they learned about 5 senses, but I think it's much more complex than that. And I think every individual has differences that that we need to consider. Another one might be gravity. Some people experience gravity differently than others, which is the reason why if you're flying in an airplane, some people might be very uncomfortable when they change and fly through different regions, and the air pressure, they experience that air pressure in their head, and they feel like their head's going to explode. Others don't feel that. Okay? So these are all things we have to take into consideration. I want to move on in the interest of time. But those are the hyper and hypersensitivities. If you're interested in hearing more about that, or you'd like some resources, I'll be happy to share those with you. Additionally, and this is closely related, you may not know, but as many as 10% of children in the United States, school-age children, have learning disabilities. What is a learning disability? Well, I know growing up when I was a kid, nobody knew what a learning disability was. And certainly older people don't know what learning disabilities are. If somebody wasn't learning something well in school or easily in school, typically we would just move on and say, well, they're just not getting it. These days we have special education programs that meet the needs of those kids, and we often offer them supports in classrooms. Unfortunately, in a catechism class, you might not have access to those supports. And you also may not know which of the kids sitting with you have learning disabilities, and that's not something that a parent needs to disclose to you. Legally, it's not required. Okay? So knowing that, keep that in mind, and I'm not suggesting by any means that every child that's moving around or is fidgeting has a learning disability, because probably that's not true. Remember, 90% of them don't, right? I think we need to remember that. 90% don't have a learning disability. But there might be real reasons for why they're struggling. They don't understand. And the same is true with ADHD. Okay? And for years there's been this controversy out there about ADHD. Does it exist? Should we treat it with medication? You may not know, but a large percentage of our school-age population is taking medication for ADHD. And I personally think that it's too many kids. But that's a whole nother discussion. The point is that there might be clinical reasons for why they're struggling. Okay? These are things to keep in mind. The things that we can work on, that you can have some control over, that's what I want to talk about with you. Because whether or not a child has a diagnosis of a disability is not something you can control, right? But what you can control is how you present information to them, to all sorts of learners, okay? Language is another issue, and I'm assuming that since we're doing this presentation in English, we're all teaching in English, right? I'm assuming that. But I also know that if you're coming from a parish where there are children that speak other languages, you might also be delivering the information in a different language, okay? My children both went through catechism in Ukrainian, okay? But my children are also both fluent speakers of Ukrainian because we speak it at home, okay? And some children, that are coming over from other countries might be proficient and fluent in Ukrainian, but might be struggling with the English you're telling them, or the English that you might be using. And so obviously this is a challenge as well, because maybe we need to have two sets of lessons, or maybe we need to translate back and forth. And I struggle with this all the time, because I already told you that I'm a counselor in SUM, the Ukrainian Youth Association SUM. I meet with children regularly, weekly, and I have groups of children who, some of whom are fluent in Ukrainian, some of whom are not, some of whom only understand English, and so I have to go back and forth all the time, and it's taxing, it's tiring to go back and forth in both languages. But obviously that affects their attention. If they don't understand you, they're not going to pay attention to you. That's the bottom line. They will not listen. It's not meaningful to them. They won't encode it. They're getting nothing out of it if they don't understand. Okay? So we can think about those things. Okay? The final thing, which leads me to context, environment, is family systems and dynamics. And I really think this is a really, really important piece of this attention picture. Okay? Think about various questions. For example, how important is it to teach catechism to these kids? I mentioned the family who may be, just wanting to have a party in a couple of weeks, right? And I don't mean to be critical of families by any means, but I feel like as a parent, I've lived through some of this and I've seen it firsthand, where I've had parents say to me, well, they're not learning anything anyways. And I'm like, well, when was the last time before they were getting ready for catechism that they were actually in church with you? Because we do have those families, right? They didn't come to church before catechism, but now it's important, so now we're going to come to church. So a child that's never been exposed to the catechism before is not going to learn it for the first time when they're 7 or 8. That's the reality. Okay? Does that sound horrible? Am I a bad person in saying this? Well, they come. But I really think that context is important. Okay? Parents' attitudes and beliefs and behaviors towards God affect children's development. They do. And they affect what they attend to, what they pay attention to, what they encode and make meaning of, and what they store in their long-term memory. That's what I wanted to share with you Howard Gardner's theory, because Howard Gardner is a Harvard psychologist, and he talks about how to teach or learn things multiple ways, using different modalities. Has anyone heard of Howard Gardner? Yes, one person, 2 people, 3 people. Okay, I want you all to learn about him, because I think he says lots of really good things that will be helpful to you as you teach catechism to a very diverse group of kids. Okay? Keeping in mind all the things that I've said to this point, keep in mind Howard Gardner's theory. We can teach about catechism and we can teach about the church multiple ways. I think the way that we do it currently only appeals to one particular type of learner. If we were to teach a group of children getting ready for catechism, confession, and communion. And they were sitting in this audience right now. I'm willing to bet, as animated as I am, and despite the fact that I have some fun pictures in my slides, they would get nothing out of it. Because most children don't learn in this type of a forum exactly the way this is set up right now. This is set up for a group of adult learners, okay? Here are some ideas for school-aged kids, the ones that you're teaching. If we want to teach about God, we could tap their linguistic intelligence, which we do because we read to them from the scriptures, from the Bible, from the gospel. And we give them worksheets, and we have them complete those worksheets. Okay? Not every child will learn from that. Not every child will attend to that. For some of them, reading might be hard. That's important to keep in mind. Think about this. A 7, 8-year-old is just starting to read lengthy texts. They really are. They're just starting to learn how to read lengthy texts in school. So they're not ready necessarily to receive information about God strictly through a linguistic mode. Does that make sense? Okay. So that might be one way, but it's probably not the best way. There are other ways we could teach them. If they are starting to learn about numbers, and most kids this age have already learned their numbers and they're doing some basic math, they're starting to learn about logical mathematical concepts, we can tap their logical mathematical intelligence. Okay? What does that mean? Well, Howard Gardner talks about focusing on numeric concepts when we teach other things. The church, our teachings in the catechism are full of numbers. There's one God. There's a Holy Trinity. There are 10 commandments. There are 12 apostles. I could go on, right? You know the numbers better than I do. You're the catechists, okay? But we could create whole lessons focusing on those things that appeal to them, because there are some learners that learn best through a numerical modality, okay? We could focus on pictures and spatial intelligence, okay? Think about space. We talked earlier a little bit about that some kids move around, they fidget. You know why? Because they like to use space around them, okay? That's why children love to dance. And if you think about the Divine Liturgy is full of movement, except that, unfortunately, speaking as a parent, my children were distanced from that movement as children, okay? Now, I know that I might be suggesting something that would require us to completely rethink how we do a Divine Liturgy, but I will tell you that when I was doing catechism, or teaching catechism, I should say, when I was a graduate student, one of the things that we did with the children in my parish where I was teaching catechism is that when there was the grand entrance, all the children took part in the grand entrance, and they walked all the way around the church, and they moved through the church. Now, if you stop and think about the grand entrance, obviously it's in the middle of the liturgy. This gives them a break, gives them a chance to move, right? You could think about that in the same way when you're teaching a lesson. You could think about how you could have them get up in the middle of the lesson and move and illustrate something during the lesson, right? So how would you visually and spatially represent the Trinity, for example? Well, I know I'm borrowing from a different philosophy now, an Eastern philosophy, but in schools right now, it's very popular, for example, for children to do yoga. They could do a yoga movement of some sort to show us what the Trinity might look like. A triangle. I know this might sound weird, but think about how they will remember these things. Okay? And again, this may not work for everyone. It may not be something that you're ready or willing to do or want to do, or perhaps you don't feel that philosophically it fits with the teachings. But these are ideas, and I'm hoping to give you ways to engage learners. Okay? Another wonderful way is musical intelligence. The liturgy, the church, our teachings are full of music and prose. They're full of music and prose. Have them learn those things. Maybe they don't need to necessarily know Otche Nash or Our Father word for word saying it. Maybe it's hard for them, but what if they sing it? Because there are some musically inclined, beautiful voices in our church. Let's tap those talents and those interests. I remember my children used to attend liturgy, and they loved to look at the choir in the back, because all those wonderful, beautiful sounds were coming from there. And we would come home, and I would talk to them about, what did you hear there? Why were you looking? Oh, it was nice. I liked that sound, and I liked the way they did that. Or they'll tell me something funny about something they saw happening up there. And then I tried to incorporate that into what I was trying to teach them about the sermon that day. And these are challenges, because it requires that you move away perhaps from what's already prepared or written, and you might need to be a little spontaneous, but it does allow us to tap different types of learners, okay? Similarly, physical movement, physical experience, okay? I guess I use this example here, but we could also talk about icons over here. You see that, right? I already talked about icons earlier. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence is another one that Gardner talks about. So I talked about those two together. Yet another one that Gardner talks about is self-reflection. Okay? He talks about intrapersonal intelligence, the personal experiences that make you think about things. Obviously, personal prayer. We teach children the prayers that they need to know, obviously, but I see nothing wrong with having them write their own personal prayer. And maybe these are things that you are all already doing in lessons, but it makes it meaningful for them when they write their own prayer, okay? Similarly, social experiences fit well with Gardner's interpersonal idea of intelligence. That we are all part of a church community, that we learn from each other, and so that's why I think we do catechism classes, right? I think it would be wonderful, and again, maybe you're already doing this, but it would be wonderful if children who tapped different intelligences when they're doing homework assignments, maybe they have some choices about the kinds of assignments they might want to do to practice specific concepts, if they share all that with each other and learn from each other. So maybe one child, let's say that the lesson for the week was that we're going to study the 10 Commandments, okay? And let's say that one child chooses that they're going to read them and talk about one good thing that they did this week that illustrated it, okay? Maybe another one would do an illustration of some sort, right? Because maybe they're artistic, not autistic, sorry, artistic. And maybe a third child would, do something entirely different, like maybe they would talk about going out into the community and maybe doing something that they feel illustrates the teachings. And they could all discuss and compare and share that information among each other. Obviously, they then will be encoding that information 3 different ways. Okay? Gardner also talks about a natural intelligence, a naturalistic intelligence, experience in the natural world. Obviously, God created this beautiful world. I think it would be wonderful, wonderful for children to see that connection outside of the catechism classroom. So one of the suggestions I give later in the talk, and I do have suggestions there at the end, is, let's take catechism outside of the classroom once in a while and change the environment. It doesn't necessarily always have to be in the same setting. It could be inside the church on Sundays, Saturdays, whenever you're teaching it. Other times it could actually be outside in the sunshine. Okay? The natural world is full of God's teachings as well. And then the last of these is Gardner's controversial intelligence. It's spiritual intelligence, which obviously appeals to all of us here today. But this is the one that he's been mostly criticized for because there's no evidence for it. Okay? But I think that you all know, particularly since you're catechists. Some of you are priests, some of you are nuns. And obviously you have spiritual callings. And there are children among us that have that spiritual calling. And we need to tap and find those people. Okay? So how are we going to do that? Having said all of that about how we could possibly teach things many different ways, I come back to what I was talking about earlier, and that is that context plays a big role in all of this. And I do think that the way we present information or how we talk about things and the environment that we create is that context. Okay? So Yuri Bronfenbrenner was a psychologist, worked in the United States. He was born in Russia, but he worked in the United States. And he founded Head Start. Some of you have heard of Head Start, perhaps. Okay? It's an early intervention program. And it's intended to target children that are struggling so that they get support and help. And hopefully some of them won't be diagnosed with disabilities. I don't need to get into the history of Bronfenbrenner, but what I wanted to tell you was that his model has helped me understand development and learning throughout my professional career. And it might help you. There's an illustration on the next slide, which unfortunately I saw in the copies didn't come through nicely, so if you would like me to send you that color slide, I could do that. But it suggests that the individual is constantly affected by multiple systems that they function in. From their home all the way out to the broader community. And if you look at this illustration, one of the things you see is that one of the microsystems might be, isn't always, one of the microsystems, which is the smallest and most immediate system that has the most direct and profound impact on a person's life, could possibly be the church. For a big percentage of people, it may not be, okay? But let's hypothetically say that it could be, or that it is for some, okay? The point of that is that if what's reinforced in two microsystems, home and school, or home and the church, are consistent and they hear the same messages, right? Then it's going to have a profound and positive impact on the learner over time. And they're more likely to attend to it and remember it. Okay? What I'm telling you is it's okay to ask parents for help, and it's okay to involve them. And some of you may not be comfortable with that, or you may not even want that. I know there are parents that are not easy to work with. I know this firsthand, okay? But I think that that's important because that context and that reinforcement helps, okay? I think another question to ask is, where does faith, religion fit into the learner's life? And the answer to that question is, ask parents. Ask parents, where does it fit? Before you even get started, ask parents, okay? What is the context for your teaching them about something that might be very foreign, or it might be very familiar? Because whether it's foreign or familiar, or somewhere in between, is going to affect what they attend to. Okay? And then there are additional questions here that build on that idea that, are you building on a basis that's familiar? Will the information be reinforced? Are you using stimuli? And when I say stimuli, I'm asking, are you teaching them about the icons, which might be visually appealing to them, particularly if it's a kid that's interested in art? Or are you teaching them about the songs, which might be appealing to a child that's highly musical or hypersensitive to auditory stimuli? Are you teaching them about the movement within the church and how all of that has meaning? Because it does have meaning, right? I mean, we don't just do the grand entrance to do the grand entrance, right? We don't. We do it because it has meaning. And so that history, that meaning contextualizes all of it and makes it fun, for lack of a better word. Makes it interesting. One day when my daughter said to me, "Oh, I don't want to go to church. There's nothing there for me." And I said, "Whoa, where did we get here? How did this happen? You know, just a couple days ago you were this little baby that I took to church. You never questioned anything I did." And we started talking. We had a very deep conversation. And I started sharing with her some of my own experiences in church and how when I was a young person, we had a youth group where we explored the pieces of the liturgy. We explored parts of the liturgy and we understood all the different aspects and components. And at that point, going to church was not boring to me anymore. It was fun. It was interesting. Because I looked at it from a totally different perspective. Okay? So this brings me to sharing my personal experience. How am I doing on time? Am I okay? No. Okay. All right. Sharing my personal experiences here. I'll let you read this on your own because I really want to get to suggestions. Okay? And some of this I've possibly already said. The one thing I maybe haven't said yet is that it's not as simple as it used to be to raise children. I hate to say that, but it really isn't. The kinds of academic pressures, social pressures, and media pressures our kids experience are so different from what you and I experienced. I am that parent that limits technology use. I am that parent that has really good kids. I am that parent who takes them on Saturday to Ukrainian school and takes them to church on Sunday. And it's hard for me, even though I'm telling them what they, I'm very directive. I'm not the parent that gives them choices. Comes back to really hard. This. Well, your question was, how do we get them to attend? And for me as a parent, more importantly, how do we get them to continue to attend? Because it's not about the 10 or 15 weeks of catechism before confession. It's not. That's the very start of it, but maybe not even the start because they should have been in the church all the time before. Okay? I'm going to skip through my summary. Again, you can read all those. It's just a review of what I talked about. It's all there. The bottom line is, how do we get them to pay attention? Ask yourself, is the context a good fit for the learner that you're teaching? Is it interesting to them? Is it visually, emotionally, musically, spatially appealing to them? And is it developmentally appropriate? So here are my suggestions, the nitty-gritty stuff. First and foremost, please be aware of their line of vision and where they are looking. Sometimes we have a tendency to stand far above children. They're not looking into your eyes, they're not paying attention to you, they're looking right past you. Okay? I also would suggest keeping lessons as short as possible, which I know is hard. We have a lot of material to cover in a short amount of time, right? I would suggest no more than 30 minutes for school-aged children. And again, I know that may be hard, but there's no reason why you can't teach for 30 minutes and give them a 10-minute break to run around and then come back for the other cognitive centers. I would suggest providing more shorter lessons rather than fewer longer lessons. I think that's a better plan. And research has shown it will allow them to remember what you're saying for longer periods of time. They will encode the information better. So what I would propose is maybe considering doing confession and communion over the school year and maybe even over 2 school years. We tend to cram it into the 3 months just before they go to communion, right? Maybe we need to spread it out more, okay? Again, familiarity of content will allow them to retain more. I come back to, please don't expect them to listen to every single thing or sit for long periods of time. They won't. It's not possible. Okay? I'm sure you haven't heard every single word I said too, but hopefully you're getting the big picture. Okay? This is really important. I think it's really important for us to model good attention. And by modeling, I mean, I think that we can ask them a non-catechism question at the start of every lesson and look them directly in the eye and genuinely be interested in what they have to say. And sometimes they're going to tell you something really funny, really off base, really weird. That's what they're thinking. It's okay. It's okay. That's where they're at. Okay? I think that builds rapport. It builds trust with them. If they see you're interested in them, they're probably going to be more interested in you. Okay? Try to provide very concrete and simple examples for them. Please don't read from the scripture directly. They don't understand the language. It's too abstract, and they're not getting it. They don't. Tell them stories instead. You all know the catechism very well. You know the scriptures very well. Explain it to them through a story. I think that's far more appealing to children. I also think it's really important to be aware of children's fears and emotions. My daughter said this to me a few days ago. Now, she went through catechism a long time ago now. She said to me, when I was going through catechism, I was really scared of eating body and blood. That's scary. Does anybody ever think about that? First of all, it's a very abstract concept. And children think very concretely, and it can be very scary to them. So I think we have to be careful about how we present information that is abstract. Okay? I think we need to present information using multiple stimuli, and that's why I talked about Howard Gardner. That's why I talked about different types of sensitivities, because not every child will understand the same concept in the same way using the same stimuli. Some children will get it better using different methods, different stimuli, and I think that's very important. Okay? They also will not attend to everything, as I've already said, but they're going to attend to the things that are most interesting to them. The things that are visually appealing to them, the things that they like, that they think are cool. One of the things my son said is, tell them to make it fun, okay? He remembers the things that were fun, and I remember when he went through his catechism, it was lovely that Father Taras spoke to him in the church, with the entire church environment, context around him. And as we spoke about the catechism and the concepts, he pointed things out in the physical structure in the building. And my son remembers that. He to this day remembers, and will always probably remember, that in our church at the top there are the four evangelists, from the four Gospels, and that one of them is Matei, and that there are animals associated with each of them. He remembers the story about the animals and what those represent. Okay? I also think it's good to develop homework choices for children rather than perhaps worksheet. This is something to think about maybe in developing new curricula. I don't know. But maybe to have different choices for children that might appeal to different types of things for them. And then they can decide what they want to do. They still have to do homework, but it's not so much of a chore. They get to choose which of the two assignments is more appealing to them. Okay? Maybe the musical one or the one that requires them to draw something. You see where I'm going with this? Okay? You can still teach the same thing two different ways. And I've already pointed out and said that you want to vary the context, change the environment from time to time. So I've already said that. Okay? I allowed you to ask questions during my presentation. I certainly will be happy to answer more later. But I think this is really important for kids. They are asking a question when you piqued their interest. or something didn't make sense. And they do not have the mental capacity, their brains are not neurologically mature to hold off on that question to the end. They're going to forget it. And then we've missed a learning opportunity. We've missed a learning opportunity to answer something for them that they need to know about, they want to know about, they're curious about. So I would reinforce their curiosity and interest by allowing them to ask questions during the lesson. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. Again, my son made me write this, make catechism fun. My final slide, I'm sorry, I know I'm keeping you, but please be patient with me one more minute if you can. My final slide, these are additional suggestions and considerations that go beyond teaching, the lessons in preparation for communion. These are things that I have thought very deeply about over the last few years as I see one child entering adolescence and another child already immersed in it. And as I told you already, I worry about what's going to happen to my kids because I would very much like for them to continue coming to church. But in a few years, as my daughter reminds me, she'll be driving. I hope she'll drive to church when she moves away to college. But when she's away at college, I'm not going to have that control over her anymore. Okay? So these are things that I think are important. One of them is that I think we need to promote the message that catechism is a lifelong process. Sadly, I think that the majority of our parishioners of our church believe that catechism lasts 12 weeks. You may disagree with me, and we can talk about that privately if you wish, but I think that's okay. Remember that children model parents' behaviors and recognize what parents value, so I would really encourage you to encourage parents to be part of the lessons, as I've already said, but also to invite them to sit up front during the Divine Liturgy. My children loved sitting up front in church. They did, and they behaved better. They did. I guess they were closer to God, I don't know. But I think the reason why they behaved better and they didn't move around so much and they didn't make so much noise and they didn't complain as much is because it was more interesting. They had something to look at instead of looking at the back of the person in front of them. Because that's what kids see in church. They see the back of the person in front of them. That's at their eye level. Remember, my first suggestion was be aware of their line of sight, right? And I would talk to parents and ask them about their concerns, which my guess is that many of you are doing and probably trying. But I think that parents sometimes feel like they're not heard or their opinion doesn't matter. And I'm not speaking for myself, but I am talking generally in being involved with other parents in the community. I do think that it's valuable to have family liturgies once in a while, maybe once a month, and also to have youth liturgies with a social hour afterwards. If you tell my kid that there's going to be breakfast afterwards, she said to me, I'll come for food. I'm sad that that's where we're at, but it's true, okay? So that's one thing to think about. This might need to be given some time, and it might mean that we might have to involve multiple communities together, because I certainly know that there are very few young people my daughter's age that currently go to church in our home parish. So I would suggest doing this maybe with 4 or 5 parishes in the same vicinity, and maybe having them get all the kids together. One group, youth liturgy. What a great way for them to meet each other. So those are important things. I also think that we need to invite parents to take on realistic roles in the community and participate actively when they are there. Again, I know that some of you may already be doing this, but I think that it goes beyond catechism. I should ask the question, do we have youth leadership councils in our archieparchy? Maybe that's something to consider, okay? Having a youth leadership council where we have kids ages 16 and up who are already driving, who would be given an opportunity to voice their opinions and thoughts and maybe take an active role in governance in the church. I don't know. But I'd be thrilled if my kids got involved in something like that. Okay? And the last one was also a suggestion from my kids. Have an anonymous suggestion box for those who are afraid to speak. And when they said this to me, I was like, I see suggestion boxes all the time, everywhere. Nobody drops anything in there. But I think the last part of it is more important than the first part. For those that are afraid to speak, teenagers are intimidated by us. They may think that they know it all, and they may not want to listen to what you're saying. But when they come to church and they see somebody knowledgeable, in the same way that I might be intimidated by you when I hear you talking about the scripture, you know far more about it than I do. Or I heard the last speaker present. It's like, wow, how do I follow that? It's intimidating to be a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old sitting in church, probably not surrounded by any of your friends these days, right? So these are things just to keep in mind, okay? If you're interested in further reading, these references are going to be very small on your slides. Again, thank you so much, and you can contact me if you have questions.
Well, we have just another outstanding presentation today. Too bad that some had to leave. But all the presentations will be published online. We'll have it on the website and also Facebook page as well. Дуже дякую вам, пане Христино. We want to thank you for beautiful presentation that you did for us. I'm not going to talk long. Just want to thank you all for coming today, and I hope you found this presentation very beneficial. And I hope that you are going to put at least some of those things into practice. Please talk to fathers. Please tell them that this is what we would like to do. Don't be afraid. Again, fear is useless at this point there. But there are a lot of things that we can implement and make it happen in our parishes. And I, for my part, will try to support you in every way that we can, and with different materials and things there. And also, please know that if you need to talk to me, if you have any suggestions, send me an email, call me, find me here at the Chancery too, and we can certainly make happen a lot of things much better than they are perhaps too. Thank you all, may God bless you all. If you have any suggestions for the next conference, because many of those things that you told me last time, I hope I accomplished today by having all these wonderful presentations here. So if you have any suggestions for next time, I'm also willing to listen to that too. Safe travels home. May God bless you and your families and children that you also teach. And please continue to do the good work that you are doing already. Slava Isusu Christu.